Welcome, friends. And you have reached me on a special episode of The Bridge. Today, my guest has given us the gift of Generation RX, and he's soon to give us the gift of letters from Generation RX. Welcome to The Bridge, Kevin P. Miller.
Well, it's a great honor to be with you, Kira. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. I've been having a great weekend, and I've been really excited to talk to you about your work. It's really important, and the way you've treated it in such a compassionate way, and I'm really excited about your work.
Well, thank you. It's a calling, I guess, like so many of us, right? I mean, you wouldn't be doing this show most likely unless you had a calling, and so many of our mutual friends the same way. So it's a great opportunity for me to connect with some of your listeners and other people around Europe and around the world, and happy to do so, believe me.
Oh, yeah. I tell you, one of the things that I really like about what you're doing is that the narrative coming from the pharmaceutical industry is that people like us who are really concerned about what's going on are just anti-scientist freaks, that just don't understand. And, you really dispel that myth quite well in your work.
Well, thanks. And that's kind of one of the, it's difficult within the time allotted in documentary films to address everything you'd like. But one of the things that I did do in the upcoming film, Letters from Generation RX, is that I did tackle that from a couple of different perspectives. And, the first film that you mentioned, Generation RX, that was really, really heavy in science, even though obviously I tried to make it as accessible as humanly possible for people who either don't get to read the science or certainly, maybe read it and can't understand it. But in the new film, I don't tackle the science as much because I do emphasize the human stories overwhelmingly in this upcoming film. But the neat thing is that I didn't have to, because I was somehow blessed to get an interview with the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health a number of months back. And as a result of that, and some of the questioning, of course, that I had in my exchanges with him, he really made it very easy for me to kind of ignore the science to a large degree, because he very clearly stated that psychiatry and psychiatric science had failed, and that the data really did not support what had been claimed so, stridently over the last 2 to 3 decades. So it was fantastic for me to have those chains taken off, because it allowed me to focus in on what I am really committed to, which is really just giving a voice to people who have either been harmed by these medicines or just had a story that, frankly, had been ignored far too often, as we all know, over the last few decades.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, my own family story, we're kind of the lucky ones. Because nobody died in the process. But my nephew was misdiagnosed as bipolar, and he was given antipsychotic medications and antidepressants, and he actually turned psychotic on them. And fortunately, we were able to do something about it before it was too late. But we're the lucky ones, and we've still gone through hell with it.
No, I can only imagine. It's one of those tales. I mean, one of my favorite stories from Generation RX was during an exchange with a science writer, Robert Whitaker. And, we explored this idea that, let's say you have a typical kid who's 6, 7, 8 years old, who is diagnosed in the classroom, basically, or by a pediatrician as being ADHD. So the natural course of action, of course, is that they put the child on Ritalin or methylphenidate. generic term. And so all of a sudden, the parents and certainly the teacher says, "Oh, well, Billy is doing so much better, and he's so much better behaved, and he seems better, has greater focus." And so then, after a couple of months of that behavior, they find that the child is lapsing back into, quote, the original behavior, end quote. And then so they up the dose of the Ritalin, and then maybe they up it again. And then what happens oftentimes is that the child will have a psychotic break. So he'll be speaking in gibberish at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and the parents, of course, are freaked out, and they run the child back to the doctor, and the doctor doesn't look at the child and say, "Oh, well, that's a known adverse effect of Ritalin." No, the doctor says, "Oh, this child is bipolar." And then when that happens, of course, as is the case with your family member, they're put on a course of antipsychotics. And bipolar, as is described currently, of course, is there is no cure. It is incurable. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, that child at 6, 7, 8 years old, who had a bad reaction, a known reaction to methylphenidate or Ritalin, is now on a ticket to antipsychotics for life. And obviously this is, just an awful, awful thing that we've done to millions of children. And it's a really big part of the reason why I do what I do and why I'm doing this new film.
Well, I thank you for it, and I've seen the devastation myself, and it makes, I guess there's a lot of shame around it as the reason why people don't talk about it, because parents want, who are doing everything that they think is right to help their kids, and it's all going terribly wrong, have this shame like they failed his parents, and then, but it's really this whole industry that's failed our children, and, parents have done what they thought was right, and it ended up terribly wrong.
Well, unfortunately, as you can imagine, I mean, this is something that I have heard so many. It really is almost countless times for me right now, mm-hmm. And I began this journey back in 1993 or so, quite unintentionally. And as I like to tell people, rather than getting into politics too much, I mean, I had I'm a humanist, so I had very sort of liberal leanings back in the 80s and 90s, and I don't identify myself as anything but independent today. Mm-hmm. But I remember being so shocked because I had produced and directed and written films about kids in crisis and about the homeless and about the poor, of course, and about race relations and so many other things. And to find that when this sort of came to me that people who were seeking alternative medicines, for example, and by that, unfortunately, I mean vitamins, minerals, herbs, you name it, mm-hmm. that they were that my liberal friends, and as it turns out, conservative friends also, were so resistant because they were so convinced that the paradigm was the right paradigm. I just saw it as a social justice issue, a medical freedom of choice issue. Mm-hmm. And, it really troubled me that so many people had just bought in to this and were willing to ignore the kinds of stories now that I've been, unearthing or that have been very graciously shared with me over the last 25 years or so. I mean, once you peel back the layer, it is just absolutely awful, and it's awful that so many people have suffered the same fate and almost identical fates as people that you've come to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's shocking, really. And now that you mention that, I too, had liberal leanings and now identify as an independent. I'm not, either side. I want the truth. I don't want a belief package, So, but I find that liberals are actually the most vehement about people questioning what's going on in this arena. About they really buy into the narrative that we're all anti-science. Nuts.
Yeah, I think that that's a little complicated because obviously on at least in the States and even throughout Canada, the conservatives have their head in the sand in health matters and in other ways, of course. And so it's this grand dichotomy about this system that we've employed, at least the democratic system and others around the world. Because, for example, I mean, the conservatives are, as we know, often more business friendly and big money friendly. And so therefore the pharmaceutical companies and big medical companies and others are given tax breaks and allowed to settle offshore and not pay billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes because they are big businesses, and of course we want them to thrive. And so the liberals, where I think you're right on spot, is that the liberals, on the other hand, believe more in the power of government to help the quote oppressed. And so it is this really odd circumstance that so many people who have been victimized find themselves in, because in the case of whether it's the MHRA or whether it's the FDA or Health Canada in Canada, these regulatory agencies are looked upon by more liberal factions as being the answer. And to credit, England's FDA, if you will, I mean, they did actually bring these questions to light many years before the FDA would even acknowledge it was a problem. And they did virtually ban SSRIs for children and teens many years before this was tackled in any way, shape, or form by the FDA. So, this is part of what makes this issue so complicated and so difficult to put forth, because it leaves a filmmaker like myself really in the middle of all of the worst worlds, in a way, because there is not a faction that I can necessarily appeal to. The people that would normally care about people's individual rights, so whether it's gay rights or the pro marijuana legalization forces, a lot of times those are actually liberal. And then yet on the other hand you have the conservatives and others who are fighting those forces, but they might actually align when they find out that people have been harmed by these drugs. It's just a very difficult fit, isn't it? And it's one of those things that makes it challenging to find where is the mainstream message, where's the mainstream audience that you can target, or more directly, I guess, who is the broadcast entity or the large broadcaster or distributor of media that is going to see that this actually is a very mainstream issue. It's just that their belief systems and maybe even some of their financial, contributors via advertising, et cetera, are running, negative or contrary to that.
Right. Exactly. It is a hard fit, but there are millions of people across the world who just want the common sense truth of the matter, and they want for agencies like the FDA to actually mean something, to actually protect us from something. So what is a peer-reviewed process really worth if it's, corrupt, money and career-driven, and doesn't protect us from anything?
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the things that I'm really kind of bummed about is that I had planned in this current film, Letters from Generation RX, to actually deal with some of that in the context of what we know as RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, because we have this system in place that if randomized controlled trials are the gold standard, which they are, quote, medically, to get a product approved, then we've narrowed the focus so much, and the drug companies know that, they need to get this randomized controlled trial to approve Paxil or some new antipsychotic. And so therefore they know that for example, they can do a study 18 times and show that their drug doesn't work. But if they just get 2 studies, and I mean by the thinnest of margins, to prove scientifically what it is that their hypothesis is, well, then their drug, quote, has to be approved because it was a randomized controlled trial. Now, obviously, you have all of these other awful incestuous aspects of RCTs that are designed specifically to hide data and to throw people out of trials who very early on had negative reactions to it. And so therefore, even though they do all those things, they certainly are, they find a way to find the lowest bar humanly possible by which to meet those standards of RCTs. And again, I would have loved to have been able to explore this further, but I decided this time around, as I said, that I was mainly going to focus on human stories, and then the only other real true focus of the film is to focus on the FDA, Health Canada, the regulatory agencies around the world that and the drug companies, of course, that by their very actions reverberated through the lives of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people, because they were ignoring the science that was right in front of their faces. So hopefully people will see themselves through the eyes of their neighbors, and will see the neglect and the abuse that I've put forth in the film, and help in creating change by demanding change.
Yeah, and really it's been scientists who have sounded the alarm for so long now, but their voices are silenced by the system, and by the rigged system. So they're ignoring the people.
It's a little strange because we have, again, it's that strange dichotomy, this divide between scientists. One of the things I find extremely fascinating in Great Britain in particular is this vehemence against homeopathy. Mm. And the voices against homeopathy are so strident, and it can't be scientifically proven, and it's all quackery, and it's ugly, and it's vehement, and it's personal. And yet, I always challenge these people on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. Well, hey man, you like talking about all this quackery. Where was your voice as somebody that's supposedly committed to the purity of science? Where was your voice in speaking out against the shoddy and false science of psychiatric medications? This is not something that a filmmaker should be in the position of being forced to unveil for the world, for the general public. And yet, here I am in my last film in particular, and in this one, doing exactly that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had people say, there's more science in Generation RX than a lot of master's dissertations. Mm-hmm. And I really think that's true. And so it's really odd to me, because who is homeopathy harming? No one. Mm-hmm. It's not even harming them financially, because it costs very little And yet this campaign from these pro-science forces is really quite offensive. I mean,
Yeah.
what's wrong with medical freedom of choice? Allow people to make their own choices based on their own belief systems. And if there is something that is harming people, which is clearly the case, in psychiatric medicine, clearly the case, we need people to align behind that message.
Yeah.
And and again, I'm not looking to pull psychiatric drugs off the market. I know that a lot of people, particularly those that have been harmed, are looking for that. But what I am advocating in my films and elsewhere is that people be given the full breadth of information by which they can make an informed choice, something that quite obviously has been missing for a long time.
A very long time, and it manifests itself in many different ways. I have been helped tremendously by actually a British homeopathy person, and I have health problems that have resulted from being gluten intolerant my whole life and never having been diagnosed properly. I was told I had fibromyalgia and IBS, and they didn't know why I had neuropathy and all that. None of their diagnoses and syndromes that they diagnosed me with actually fit everything into one explanation. And I ended up diagnosing myself, and I've done more to help heal myself than any doctor ever did. And I gave them 20 years to figure it out and help me, and they only made it worse with drugs. Throwing drugs at me and experimenting on me, which included, antidepressants that they wanted to have me on because it was all in my head. And I'm like, no, actually, it's all in my gut, which is what I've discovered. Right. And there is a connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you obviously have done probiotics and things like that to, and hope maybe enzymes and things like that have helped your digestive tract and play a positive role in the body. And it's so funny because I'll never forget, God, it was probably 20 years ago now that I was in a friend of mine had worked for NBC Nightly News, which is obviously the big evening newscast in the United States or one of them. And so he had worked for them. So I was in NBC 30 Rockefeller Plaza a number of times. And, I'll never forget walking through the offices where all the anchor people and reporters were, and on their desks, there must have been 10 different desks. I walked through 30, 40, whatever, and almost all of them had the homeopathic remedy called oscillococcinum, better known as Oscillo, Oscillo, and it's a flu remedy.
Yep.
And anybody, and I'm a single dad, and my boys are older now, but when they were young, in particular, when they'd get the signs of flu, I'd give them Oscillo, and it's something that I carry with me every single road trip I make, just in case I'm on a plane or I'm in another country and I start to feel the symptoms of the flu. But it was so odd to see that on so many desks of these conventional journalists, if you will, who would never even consider reporting about those breakthroughs or even refuting others who want to damn homeopathy so broadly. So again, this is part of the problem, and hopefully there's a shift that's happening, as I believe that there's a shift happening since the release of Generation RX, which unbelievably was 5 years ago now for me. I think there's been a huge shift in the way that a lot of people, anyway, are viewing psychiatric medications. And so hopefully this time, the gods will align, so to speak, and we'll be able to get a broader distribution and appreciation for something that is still obviously very, very timely indeed and needed information.
It's very needed information. And I just want to add to the part about the gluten-free thing and how the media treats it. they poo-poo the gluten-free thing too, and they're like, you only have to eat that way if you're celiac or intolerant, and there's just such a low amount of people that, and as if eating gluten-free and you're not gluten intolerant is going to hurt you, and so
right.
and then the whole message is, the people who are against GMOs and eating gluten-free and things like that are anti-science. They don't know, they're stupid. They don't know what they're doing. It's just a fad, things like that really come out really strong in the mainstream media because we're getting somewhere. We're taking control over, what's going into our bodies and the information that, we're getting out there, and we're getting the information that we need to make our lives better and make ourselves healthier. And, what you're doing is a massive part of that. And it's especially heartbreaking for children. And I feel like it's the same sort of mind control or something, I don't know, that allows people, say, for instance, to, circumcise their sons for no medical need. Their infant sons that are just born into the world. And, so parents are taking control. They're saying, when the school counselor is saying, well, look how active your child is, look how nonconformist your child is, they're saying, yep, he's a normal kid, huh? And not, that's what I had to do. My kid's completely normal. There's nothing wrong with him at all. And he, in first grade, they were trying to take him down that path and say he was overactive. I'm like, no, he's actually just a normal boy that can't sit for hours at a time at a desk still. That's normal for a first grader. So I don't know what you're talking about. And so they stopped after a while because everything she would point out to try to lead me down that road of ADHD, I'd say, yep, that's normal. 6-year-old boy. Everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we're dealing with a system for the most part that is still the same as it was, and after World War I in terms of education and lining all these kids up, and then, as you say, the diet, the nutrition isn't accounted for at all. So what has really changed dramatically has been the nutrition. Mm-hmm. And they said the same thing that you're saying about gluten-free, that they said about food dyes, that they said about the artificial sweeteners in the 70s, like, oh, well, this is just a really tiny percentage of people. But I think that the thing that has been most revealed to me since I've been really studying the FDA and that approval process over the last 25 years is that the vast majority of the medical science is critically flawed. Mm-hmm. And they know that. And so in the case of psychotropics in particular, with so much more at stake, of course, it's one of the things that in this new film I think comes across very powerfully. This lack of common sense, or this ignoring of common sense reasoning. Because if you knew in 1991, as I again show in the new film and I did in the last, you have these people stepping forth by the hundreds and then thousands saying, hey, Prozac caused my father to stab himself in the stomach repeatedly in front of his children. Mm-hmm. And all these awful stories that just come one after the other. And as you referred to earlier, they're all identical stories almost. Mm-hmm. When you know that, you can't afford to call them, oh, that's just an anecdote. This hasn't been proven. Well, it hasn't been proven because you haven't looked for it. Mm-hmm. If you can't, and the reason I produced Generation RX in the first place was because I saw the 1991 Prozac hearing video while I was doing research for another film in 1993. And I often tell the story of how it was so powerful, but that I never forgot it, and yet I couldn't use it in that 1993 film. But fast forward 13 years or 14 years or whatever it was, and I was killing some time in Washington, D.C. I had just gotten done interviewing two congressmen on completely different ends of the spectrum, Peter DeFazio, who's a Democrat from Oregon, who, by the way, has a GMO labeling bill right now in Congress that all kinds of people, conservatives included, are completely against.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Paul on the other side. And so I just finished interviewing them both. And we had some time to kill before we were doing something else. So I said to my cameraman, you know what, there's an FDA meeting right down the road. Let's just go in there, get some B-roll, get some shots, shoot the people on the panel, etc. So I was back in the back working on my laptop, and I really was not aware of what the hearing was that I was sitting in, because I just thought we were going in there to shoot some FDA officials on video and everything else. So I had my head down and I'm typing, and my cameraman's shooting away, and all of a sudden I remember just really lifting my head up and tilting my head and going, where have I heard this before? And it dawned on me after a couple of minutes, oh my God, this is almost verbatim what I heard when I watched the 1991 Prozac hearings on video in 1993. And so at that point, I realized, like, oh, my God, I mean, absolutely nothing has changed. And as a result, I'm going to have to do this film if no one else is going to do it. And so that's really how Generation RX came to be.
Wow.
And it continues today, you know, in other ways. And it's really quite frightening to me, as a person who cares about people first and people's informed choice, that literally 23 years after the 1991 Prozac hearing, I'm sitting across from parents and people in their living rooms and hearing the same story over and over and over again. It's shocking, it's sad, it's disappointing, and it's, no pun intended, it is maddening.
Yeah, and it's getting worse because here we have the DSM, which has gotten to be the point of being ridiculous, because normal behavior has now been deemed abnormal. You know, grief, nonconformism, things like that. They're just really making normal people appear to be sick and developing drugs for it. And so we're just getting more and more drugs out on the market that, you know, have harmful side effects that are worse than what they're being medicated for in the first place. It's getting worse.
I think you're going to like, it's not a long section on the DSM-5.
Good.
But it is a potent section. It is, I mean, I interviewed a psychiatrist and author named Gary Greenberg, who has written brilliantly about this, and he was, quote, embedded with the some of the decision makers when DSM-5 was being debated, and so there is quite a, in some ways, entertaining section on that in the new film. And it's, I think the jig is up, so to speak. I mean, I really do think that, and I'm hoping that this film helps put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of a lot of this thinking. But when people see this new film, Letters from Generation RX, I kind of think, Kira, that the only part that really leaves me still frightened about people's fate is that even though I got the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, pardon me, his name is Thomas Insel, to admit the shortcomings, to say to put it kindly, of the DSM and of this process of drugging through psychotropics. Even though I got him to admit that, his answer is that the future is in genetics.
Mm.
And so therefore, and you see this in the Human Brain Project in the EU that's going on right now, that they've raised, I think they've committed $1.4 billion US, perhaps more, throughout the EU to studying the genetics of the brain. And of course, the United States, the NIMH, he's saying the same thing. Well, the drugs have failed, but you need to trust us that we're going to unveil the 100 trillion synapses in the brain, and we're going to create new remedies for the brain. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I mean, I obviously understand that there is great merit in studying genetics, but I also completely realize that any kind of meaningful, truly meaningful therapeutic use of genetics for particularly brain health is at least 30 or 50 years away.
Mm-hmm.
So are we supposed to say these very characters that now, quote, humbly are admitting that, yes, we failed, and yes, the science, the data doesn't show that the science works for psychotropics. But we're supposed to invest what? Another 30 years and another tens of billions of dollars into that methodology of studying genetics. What are all the people in the meantime that are, quote, suffering from these psychiatric disorders? What are they supposed to do?
Right.
Are they supposed to just continue on antipsychotics? Are they supposed to continue on SSRI antidepressants?
Mm-hmm.
Are they supposed to continue on schizophrenia meds or on ADHD meds? So one of the things that I hope the film unveils, and we didn't get into the genetics part. I mean, the film, believe it or not, is the longest film I've ever produced. Right now it sits at 2 hours.
Wow.
And I am super critical of myself and of story flow. And, we'll find out, by the time that the film is released, if it remains at 2 hours. Mm-hmm. But right now it's flowing very well. I think it's a fascinating film, largely because of the personal stories that are in it. But we'll find out. But even with 2 hours, I was not able to get into the whole genetics section. So, I've unveiled some things in there that I think are hopeful stories, in particular, on people that were on the brink of disaster or who faced death or faced the worst that mental illness could dish out, and came back in a non-drug way to treat themselves and heal themselves, and have been this way for decades now. So, but, it's a complicated issue, as we said at the outset. Mm-hmm. And I'm just praying that people, again, will both see themselves through the eyes of their neighbors, and then also get some common sense when it comes to making the decision to not quickly pull the trigger on the use of these medication, certainly not with all the information they need before making that critical choice.
Right, and certainly not with children whose brains are still developing. That's where, you really have to
Indeed.
draw the line there and say, hey, wait a minute. No way.
Yeah, what we've done with children, as you know, it's just, it truly is criminal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you have cases that are going on that you have 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds on bipolar meds.
Unacceptable.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you and I could go on and on and on forever because, people have often asked me, well, when you do interviews, with conventional media, maybe I have a bipolar expert next to me or whatever. They aren't you afraid because, they know all this and all that and you're not a medical doctor? And I go, I'm really not.
Mm-hmm.
because there's not anything that they could throw by me right now that I don't feel I have the answer to. I mean, when there's a study that it was not a study, it was a poll that was done on ABC News of all things years ago, and it was something about would you give your baby, meaning less than a year old, an SSRI if it was medically indicated. And I took a screenshot of this, and I would have loved to have put it into film, but you can't use it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use everything. But the number of people that responded that would be willing, well, if the doctor advised me, yes, I guess I would. I mean, I believe it was above 75%.
Wow.
Now that's just insanity, isn't it?
It is, and it shows how controlled the narrative is and how controlled our perceptions are through the media. Very controlled, very tightly controlled. And that's how, the mainstream media functions, is that they'll take someone like you and give you a few minutes to get out a really complicated subject and then, turn to some hack to say some, to toe the company line. And, wow. Mm.
Well, hopefully, again, I mean, all things are possible. And
right.
if indeed we can get to the point politically that was nearly impossible in the United States, where gay marriage is all of a sudden acceptable to certain political factions that in no way, even 5 years ago, did you believe it would be, or medical marijuana, or the legalization or certainly decriminalization of marijuana, obviously legal in Colorado and California and Western states. I mean, if we've gotten to that point so quickly, that's because of real people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if real people, through seeing this film, through hearing other advocates or reading other source material or whatever it is, deem that this is just ridiculous and unacceptable, then we can push this message out in such a way that it will dominate and force the mainstream media to deal with it. And if they don't deal with it, well, their ratings are already going down because of everything from Netflix to you name it, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if they don't deal with it, then they just slide further into oblivion. So they can either get on board and start championing or at least covering fairly some of these things that we're discussing, or they'll simply get run over.
Mm-hmm. And they have some pretty, I like to pick apart the ads that they put on for, these various powerful medications. And you find phrases like thought to be, considered connected to, and that they're not even telling you, we know this for sure is going to help you. It's, and you'll hear things like the side effects where they list them all, and trouble breathing, and just things that are really important and not as bad as what you're medicating. For me, it started when I had this reaction to Lyrica because I don't have fibromyalgia, because fibromyalgia doesn't really exist. It just means we don't know what's wrong with you or how to help you. But we need to call it something so we can bill insurance. So the Lyrica, when you go on there, they say, well, fibromyalgia is thought to be a result of overactive nerves. Okay, what's causing the overactive nerves? Well, we don't know, but you're going to drug me anyway? It's not even logical.
And that's a hilarious conversation. And it's really amazing that you bring fibromyalgia up a couple of times because of your personal experience, because the film that I was telling you about that I produced in 1993, which was called Let Truth Be the Bias and was narrated by the great James Earl Jones, who some might know as the voice of Darth Vader. And even this is CNN way back when.
Yeah.
But anyway, for that film, I interviewed a quote alternative MD, Dr. Murray Susser in California, about fibromyalgia. And I interviewed a number of his patients who were put in that categorization way back when, obviously more than 20 years ago, and they were completely cured by diet and some vitamins and some aminos and some other things. So, I mean, again, it just goes to show you how the drug industry, that they all they care about is milking every last dime of profit out that they can, which is for fibromyalgia or Lyrica is no different than the antipsychotic or SSRI drugs. I mean, even though we have all this stuff happening that I referred to 10 minutes ago about the NIMH director saying we're done and this, that, and the other, I mean, they will not let go until they get all of the drugs out of the distribution chain, et cetera. And they plan on, I mean, they get an 18-year patent. So they will, what the FDA has done and Health Canada has done and so many other regulatory bodies have done is that they've allowed them, even though these serious adverse events show up everywhere, like they started in 1991 with Prozac, right? 2004, we were having the same conversation. And 2006, they finally put a black box warning on it. And so they basically played the whole thing out so that the drug companies could profit to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars in profit from those drugs. And then miraculously, when the patent runs out, oh my, we reveal all this shoddy science. And the director of NIMH gives his mea culpa, looking very serious about these drugs, and oh, we're really sorry. So, that's the insidious part of this that needs to change. And, my mission is that people be given this information so that over the next 30 years, while they are pursuing the, quote, cure, genetic cure, end quote, for brain disorders, that we don't have tens of millions and hundreds of millions more people suffering the same fate that hundreds of millions suffered over the last 30 years. And that really has to come through education.
Yes, and the right information and non-compliance. We have to just not comply with the madness because that's our right. That's our human right to find whatever, alternative works for us. And it shouldn't even be the alternative. It should be, what is. Because now that's another great thing because I actually near the end of Letters from Generation RX have a researcher who's been fighting like mad. She has been fighting like mad since 1996 to study minerals, one particular formula called Empower Plus for depression, for bipolar. And the regulatory agencies in Canada and elsewhere have been brutal, vicious, unbelievable. So you have this woman who has fought that, so hard. And she said almost the exact same words that you said, Kira. She said, drugs should be the supplement in an ideal world. The very
I'm not saying that that people can't benefit from them, particularly in an acute crisis. I mean, if someone is going to kill themselves, to take a shot in the behind and knock yourself out for a couple of days until you can get into a more protected state, perhaps, or whatever use they're used for, or if people find them tremendously beneficial for depression, even though it's not been proven to be better than a sugar pill, they should have the right to do that. But they should be the supplement. And these things that we're calling alternatives, certainly for children, as you say, should be nutrition should be one of the go-to. Therapy, talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, the things that will, quote, first do no harm. Right. So I couldn't agree with you more. Yep. And neither could Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, who's the brilliant and brave researcher that I'm referring to.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful for her work. It's really important, and everybody I know. Well, I'll tell you, my mother spent most of her career in the pharmaceutical industry, and even she'll tell me, don't take anything that hasn't been out on the market for at least 10 to 20 years, and because she knows how the FDA works, and she actually got fired for doing her job, which was not approving a batch. She was in quality control, quality assurance. Her last job was, making the antidote for bee stings. And she said, nope, this batch doesn't meet quality standards, and it's my job to not approve things. And they said, well, you're fired. And that was her job. So people who are afraid of losing their jobs, the system is definitely controlled, and it's controlled by fear. Not only fear of the people who are working in that system, that they'll be marginalized or lose their jobs or whatever they fear, but it's enforced by fear through the media as well, and they're certainly not touching the fact that these school shootings are connected to SSRIs. They won't touch that with a 10-foot pole, because that's going to open up a real.
No, you're right. I mean, it's hard to ignore the fact that the media, and I mentioned this in the new film, the media has certainly played, they are accountable. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that part of it is that I had an interaction with a New York Times reporter who shall go unnamed right now, after Generation RX came out, and he and I interacted, and I said to him, because he had been writing about a lot of mental health issues, and so I said to him, well, listen, I've unveiled all the science here. I've named names of people at the FDA, Dr. Thomas Loughran, Dr. Robert Temple, Dr. Paul Lieber, and many others, and I'd like to send you a copy of the film. And so he, very enthusiastically said, sure, send me a copy at this address. So I sent him a copy, and there was no word back. So I started emailing him. Finally, he got back to me. He said, oh, well, I never received it, which was nonsense, because I had delivered it by prior email with a signature and had all of that. So I said, oh, well, I'll send you another copy. So I sent him 2 copies. And then he basically just didn't acknowledge it in any way, shape, or form. And so it turns out that a couple of years later, some whistleblowers at the FDA had come out and said that they were that the FDA was spying on their emails, and they had, almost like during Richard Nixon's presidency, he had an enemies list. Well, the FDA had an enemies list, these whistleblowers revealed. And later on, through congressional hearings, that list was revealed. And this reporter was on that list. And so I emailed him back. This was years later. It was probably a year or 2 ago. And I emailed him back, and I said, how does it feel now that you ignored all of this evidence? And he did do some good reporting. I don't want to say that he didn't do any good reporting, because he did. He talked about conflicts of interest within NIH and some other things that needed to come out, and he obviously could have spent maybe a lifetime reporting on conflicts of interest. But I said, how does it feel now that you find out you're on the enemies list? And he wrote me back. First of all, he said, well, I don't really care. And then he revealed that now he's not inside the Beltway anymore, where he was dependent upon all of his, quote, sources for information. Now he's reporting for the New York Times from India.
Wow.
So I thought, well, that's about as far away from the Beltway as you can get, isn't it, man? Mm-hmm. So I was like, yeah, if I was in India, I wouldn't really give a damn. Now you're probably reporting on India pharmaceuticals and whatever. But anyway, it just goes to show you that, yeah, that fear is instituted. It's instituted at journalists, because if you're inside the Beltway and you depend on getting an interview with Thomas Insel, NIMH, or with Thomas Loughran at FDA or any of the other, bureaucratic agencies, and all of a sudden you are reporting things that are negative, quote, honest, but negative, then you get shut off and you don't get your stories anymore. And so therefore, maybe your story appears on page D26 as opposed to on the front page or in the front section. So fear is a weapon, and they've used it quite ruthlessly. Mm-hmm. And it's to the detriment of parents and children and truly all of us.
Yeah, and so that's why we do stuff like we're doing now with, alternative radio, and we, just get the information out there because it's important. We have to become our own sort of citizen journalists and do our own research and share information with each other and talk about things that are uncomfortable to talk about for the betterment of our communities and our own lives. And it
is vital. I guess, it's interesting. We share a friendship with Thomas Sheridan, mm-hmm. brilliant Irish writer and commentator and so much more. And there was an event in Bath, England, called ARC that he and I both spoke at. And I think there was a lot of people who are drawn to alternative information, if you will. And I had sort of the audacity, I guess, to get up there and I say, you know what? I mean, I understand that there is great worth in a lot of what's being put forth here. But for me personally, in this realm of medicine, mm-hmm. I almost resent this conspiracy theory kind of label because there is nothing conspiratorial about this. There is nothing but truth, and I've put it forth in my films. So I'm a very reluctant member of the conspiracy club. I mean, I appreciate the support and the passion and indeed what they are trying to do. But it kind of ticks me off that, when you're doing things that should be of mainstream importance, and that goes for your work and goes for every, a lot of the people I respect within this genre, if you will. But, a lot of this should be mainstream, and we shouldn't be labeled as alternative any more than vitamins and minerals should be mm-hmm. labeled as alternative.
And certainly the conspiracy theory label is used to marginalize anybody who comes up with something that should, like you say, have mainstream appeal and should be information that's available to everyone so they can make the most informed decision possible. I can, see how you would resent it.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I have a lot of great friends who are doing really important work in other areas in medicine and beyond, that if we don't band together, mm-hmm. I guess here's the thing about it, though, Kira, that's interesting is that there are so many groups, let's say, in this area of truth in psychiatry mm-hmm. that have been so gracious to me. And I've met so many good friends, and they're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people, and by large, right? But when we and by the way, the establishment knows this. When we force people into quote alternative groups, what really happens is that oftentimes the big egos take over. So then you have, I'm not going to name names here, but you have very prominent MDs and psychiatrists and others who are very big in this movement, who then go at war with one another. Mm. And so what happens is in this already smaller movement, they work to fracture this movement mm-hmm. because you've got egos of somebody that, well, he still prescribes schizophrenia meds or something, and this one over here doesn't and stopped doing it years ago. And so there's this fracturing that happens, this infighting that happens, and that is the most detrimental thing, of course, and only plays into the hands of those people that would love to suppress this information for another 10 years, for another 20 years. And so that's what I've always tried to stand against.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's important that we grow up as movements.
Yeah.
And let integrity rule the day. And who gives a damn if somebody, makes a personal choice to still prescribe this, or they don't believe 100% of what I believe. Respect them for the fact that they are on your side for a vast majority of this stuff. And stop the nonsense, stop the political nonsense and the infighting, because that's indeed how they've fractured the quote alternative medicine movement in the United States. We passed in 1994 here in the United States something called DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, and it was a monumental thing. It's the only reason we have such, dare I say, the word libertarian, not the politics, but it's the only reason we have such libertarian policies on vitamins and minerals in this country, and the only ones like it in the world. And it's because we've been given through this legal congressional edict the freedom to do so. But we've had this whole movement now divided because the politics have shifted. Back when we passed DSHEA, we had the most conservative of Republicans, I'll say like Orrin Hatch, senator from Utah, aligning with the most liberal Democrats, let's say Peter DeFazio or Dennis Kucinich, to say that the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act should be passed, and people should be given this freedom to select these, vitamins, minerals, herbs, whatever, if that's what they choose. And we can't turn them into drugs. We're not going to allow you to turn them into drugs. Well, now, as you know, the movement has been fractured because the politics have changed so dramatically. So now we've got anybody that's a Republican, so anybody that would even consider voting for, Mitt Romney or Bush or anybody else, is now politically so far asunder from Obama or John Kerry or Al Gore or whomever, that now that dividing line has been set in concrete and steel, and there's almost no breaching it. Well, now that means there's no cooperation now. So now trying to get something that's common sense like a GMO labeling law so that you can actually see this genetically modified corn or soy or whatever in the foods that we're giving our children, not to mention our elderly, now that becomes almost an impossibility because we've allowed big business and others to divide us politically so dramatically that it's almost to the breaking point now. So what the miracle of DSHEA from 1994 is now, today, it would be absolutely impossible. Yeah. And that's what we as citizens need to take back. Screw you guys. You guys are giving yourselves raises. You guys are, saying you're doing this in our interests. We need more cooperation across the aisle, or we're just going to throw you out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've certainly never seen anything like it. It's things aren't all as they seem. So many of the things that we really thought were going to happen when Obama got in, it hasn't happened. And when you talk about whistleblowers, for instance, the Obama administration has gone after more whistleblowers than Bush ever did. He's been really, really hard on whistleblowers. And at the same time, we have the laws in place where whistleblowers are supposed to be protected, but whistleblowers are not protected at all. And in fact,
well, I agree with that. I mean, 100% I agree with that. On the other hand, after 9/11, and of course President Bush too was in power, So, on the other hand, you gave more power to the state in every way that affect everything from crops that are grown to what's in food to notifications to obviously personal privacy, whether it's via mobile phone or what have you. So, I mean, the roots of all of this were really sowed after 9/11. And then, in my opinion, a lot of there's no doubt that President Obama has done what you said he did. And what they've done is that they have re-upped and they've reapproved all of the freedom robbing, aspects of those personal bills, privacy bills, and everything else that were instituted right after 9/11 in the heat of fear of terrorism. So yeah, it's been a sad continuation. On the other hand, as I gladly tell my super conservative friends, if they will have this conversation with me, he's also faced this very obstructionist Congress that would not allow anything to be passed so that they can call him, the least effective president since whomever, right?
Right.
So, I mean, they've done nothing. They've done nothing for the people that they supposedly represent. And, again, it's this divisiveness that is killing us as a country. And it's making us, toothless, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we're losing our power. I don't mean power in terms of power of the state. I mean, the beauty of when I grew up, and I'm in my 50s, of course, and the beauty of when I grew up was that you had, one-parent households that could support an entire family. And why I've fought so hard for the poor and for the homeless and for others over the years is because I remember the day when people who were, we had a thriving middle class and we could actually support a middle class where parents chose to keep one parent home, and how that one single action of giving middle class people a little more money than they were ever able to earn before through unions and through other things, the fact that we've lost that is crippled our country.
And it's never coming back either. That's one thing that people have to face, is it's not coming back in the way that it was here before. I mean, the middle class is decimated. Corporations have more rights than people. So unions are sold out.
You're right. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm an optimist, so I mean, but you're right when you say it's never coming back in the way that it was. I agree with that.
Right. So we have to reimagine what we can do with what we have, which is we're all in the same boat now. So let's work on this together. We're all poor now because they want it all. So let's reimagine something that works for everyone. And we need to leave the elitism behind us. And like you say, it's the elitism and the egos that divide us and fractionate us and keep us from taking back the power.
And we need to make choices. I mean, we do, whether they like it or not. There are power in the masses, and so again, as with everything else, it just always comes down to education. And should I be blessed, if someone within the sound of my voice can hear me right now who is wealthy and cares about the issue of free trade, I'm so wonky that I would love to do a documentary on free trade, because so many of the issues that we're discussing are rooted in the changes in free trade. What used to be called fair trade is now free trade. And so in 1994, matter of fact, ironically, right around the time that Deshay passed, the drug companies and the food companies and the power players got their heads handed to them on a plate. And so they said, well, they're scratching their heads. Well, we're not going to be able to do it this way anymore. We can't defeat them this way. So we got to find another way. So what they did was they took this thing called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which had been in force as a general trade guideline agreement since World War II. And they took that and they transformed that into what? Well, what we all know now is the WTO. Mm-hmm. So, when that happened, that shifted the earth dramatically. Now, in the United States, there's something that, I remember in my interview with Ron Paul as we discussed this back in 1995, that, every 5 years our Congress has to reapprove our membership in the WTO mm-hmm. because it is by choice. And so therefore, even if we just were to say, you know what, we don't like the direction that corporations are taking the nation and the world, and so we'll still do trade with you, but it'll be free trade. But we're going to back out of the WTO this time around. If you guys get your act together, then we might rejoin again in 5 years or whatever, but we're going to sit this out for 5 years, and we're going to institute fair trade, not free trade like NAFTA or CAFTA or all the deals that are going on throughout the EU right now and between Asia and North America and whatever. And if we were to do that, if we were to reveal that to people as one of the real heartbeats of why so much of what you've just so articulately stated are happening, then we could create real change against the wishes of the true power players. But of course, we need people to mobilize themselves, and we need people who care enough to know, or at least listen to people who have some kind of information about policy and care about it enough to mobilize people in that way, just like we're trying to mobilize people around psychotropics through letters from Generation RX, mm-hmm. for example. It can be done. It really can be done. It seems impossible. Yeah. But I know it can be done.
I hope so. And I would encourage anybody who has a vision like yourself for making it happen to make it happen. I support that, fully support that. And it's part of us reimagining what, a better reality for ourselves than what we've been faced with. And part of it is saying, okay, well, this is what's wrong. And you really have to honestly look at it, which is uncomfortable. And that's where a lot of people get sort of derailed, is looking at that, what's wrong, and getting caught up in that and saying, then fear turns into anger. But anger's fine. There's nothing wrong with anger. And there's nothing wrong with moral outrage, that's for sure, because it fuels projects like what you're doing. And, we have to be willing to tell the truth, even if we have to stand alone and tell it for however many years until people join with us and support us.
Well, we were talking before about, legalization of pot and gay marriage and so many other things. And, part of the reason that shifted is because there are people who are, in their 40s and 50s, obviously that have lived through all this, but really also because there's a new generation of young people who are voters and who are taking over in prominent roles in our society, and they're just saying, well, this is just nuts. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know too many gay people. I know, I've observed too many people. I know too many people that smoke pot, and it's not what they say it is, mm-hmm. whether or not you want to recommend that everyone do it or this, that, and the other, whatever. But, they realize that this is like, for them, it's a non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where the hope is for me. I don't believe that the baby boomers are going to be the ones that change this necessarily. I'd be thrilled if we got the ball started.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's going to be the young people, the younger generation, who just say, as you said, this is just unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to allow this kind of discrimination to take place. And when you're giving all my friends Ritalin or Risperdal every day, and we're watching them whack out on this stuff, and they're 14 and 16 and 18 and 21, and don't tell me about pot, okay?
Right.
Don't tell me about the dangers of pot when you're using these mind-bending drugs on people of my generation. And so they've got this perspective. They're not hippies. They're not, we'll just, drop acid and see the beauty of the world and, whatever. They're not going from that perspective. Although, interestingly, we do have an awful lot of young people in England and Canada and the U.S. and abroad who are experimenting and trying ayahuasca,
Mm-hmm.
which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not coming at it from that just, drop acid and tune out and, that kind of a thing. They're coming from a spiritual place, a real place of trying ayahuasca so that they can drop ego long enough to just look at the horror of their own manifestations, of their own ego manifestations. And how do I reconnect with spirit in a way to really find what is important in life and what I should be focusing on.
So using ayahuasca as a tool to do one's own shadow work is what you're really describing here.
Yeah, I mean, ayahuasca is a very serious spiritual medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certain that there are people out there who have used it and tried to do it within the realm of like it's a party drug.
Right, right.
But if you try to do ayahuasca and you come into it arrogantly and not humbly, and you try to use this in a way that is a party drug, you will get your ass handed to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, Mother Ayahuasca will slap you down so hard that you will know what hit you, and you may not know what hit you, actually, and what train ran over you. So, what I sense, particularly in younger people that have tried this medicine, which is, a combination of herbs and roots and things from the Amazon, a very serious psychedelic medicine. It is not to be taken lightly. But for the people that are doing it with, dare I say, credible shaman and healers, and doing it as a spiritual experience, oftentimes it is just a life-changing experience, because they are able to step outside their body enough to say, I'm not in charge of anything. And if I'm going to be in charge of anything, it's going to be my own ego. And I'm going to get grounded and rooted in something more spiritual and more meaningful. And to hell with all of this commerciality and all this nonsense and Kardashians and BS that people are consuming in copious amounts every single day. That's the heartening thing for me, that, that people are actually exploring it for real answers to transform themselves.
And it should be the approach to all ceremony, to take, to approach it humbly and with the intention of something good coming from it. I actually didn't know much about ayahuasca till recently, but because the native tradition that I've been taught is the Lakota way, which doesn't involve.
Well, I was going to compliment you about the Lakota music up front that you merged and married with, powerful stuff. By the way, all of your listeners, and certainly you personally, if you are not aware, please go and research someone whom I just respect immensely, who's a friend of mine. I can, humbly say that I'm honored to be his friend. And his name is Warfield Moose Jr. And he has a new website. And if you just, he's on, I know he's on Instagram, he's on Facebook. And Warfield and I met a number of years ago. And he through that meeting one day asked me if I would produce a very short film for him, just simply because he was going to use it as an intro to an audience he was speaking to at Virginia Tech like 2 days later. So in one day, in 4 hours or something, there's a video on my YouTube page, which is, I think it's under the moniker Kevin Phillip Miller.
Okay.
But it's about Ben Black Elk. And so you can go see this 4-minute video, and it's actually, I think, on my Vimeo, Vimeo page as well. But anyway, all of your listeners should certainly seek out Warfield Moose, and he is one guy who is certainly worthy and very powerful, and he's an amazing man.
The music, the intro music is actually by a group called A Tribe Called Red, and they are First Nations DJs who decided to make dance music and sample in powwow music, and I love it. So
I love it too. And by the way, Warfield Moose Jr. Also has, he has music on Amazon that's the traditional Lakota. And, I love his music. It is very powerful, very powerful. And there's so many days when I'm driving out, doing something for a film. When I was in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains in remote Western Canada, I just put on Warfield's music and, just, I don't want to say rock out, but good,
That's
good Lord. But I was rocking out, again, if you're shadowed by the Rocky Mountains and listening to Warfield Moose, life is good as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, another good a powwow group to listen to if you're traveling through the Rockies is Stony Park. They're one of my favorite powwow groups, and I sing powwow myself. I was taught by a Lakota to sing powwow back in the 90s and was adopted. And actually, my brother's the one who introduced me to my husband, and we both sang with him for many years, and now we have our own drum, and it'll go to our son, when it's his time to take over the drum.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I've always wanted to do a film about Lakota, always, and I've done Yuwipi ceremonies and certainly sweat lodges and you name it over the decades.
Sundance?
And I've done Sundance, and as a matter of fact, a good friend of mine just did Sundance in Western Canada in BC, and we were talking about the experience just a few days ago when I was with him. And it's again, if God were to bequeath me with millions of dollars, the films that I would do would be all in this genre. It would be Lakota and free trade and all the things we've talked about, because I do see them as so interconnected with the direction that our young people need to go, or at least be conscious of. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, we need to be more humble than we've ever been in, quote, civilized world. Mm-hmm. And there's such great power and so many lessons that so many vital people like Warfield and others have to share. And we need to, drop ego and turn off the noise and really try to reground ourselves in whatever ways we can in this world where everything's crazy and people are all wrapped up into, whatever's on their iPhone or whatever else. I mean, there's another path there, and fortunately a lot of people are seeking it. But when we get some kind of mass consciousness, it will be no surprise when you see some of this stuff that we're complaining about and that I've spent 6 years, 8 years swallowing death listening to. Some of this stuff will start to meld away when we readjust our perspective and get quiet and reconnect with the beauty of the earth and the real power that is out there.
Yeah, and that's important. I think we're kind of back to compassion now too, because that's a spiritual practice that you find in all traditions, and one that we can look to Lakota tradition so well now because it's it's still very strong in that tradition. It hasn't been steamrolled over as long as it has maybe in some of our European traditions. It's really right there and accessible, and the ceremonies are still going on, and they're still accessible. And the first, I would say, real religious experience I had was in a sweat lodge, and I saw the eyes of my child, who I didn't have until it was 1997. I didn't have him until 2005, and I was told I would never have a child. So, and I hadn't even met his father at that point. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
And I saw what looked like a star, and it was flickering, and it was flickering between blue and white. And it was like a month or two later that I met my brother, Peter Brokenleg, and I asked him about that, and he was like, "Oh, that's Tinkashla," like, oh, okay. Should have known that. But yeah, so it's a beautiful tradition.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I've always, I remember that, speaking of dealing with, quote, unconventional topics and within conventional media, back in the 90s, I won a number of Emmys, and I produced this film, The Promised Land, which was about the homeless, and then I was asked to produce this 1-hour documentary for an NBC affiliate about race relations. And so I said, well, I'll do it if you allow me to trace feature the roots, the origin of the roots. And the guy actually said to me, the general manager of this NBC affiliate, he actually said to me, "Oh, you mean Martin Luther King?" And I was like, "No, I mean the Native Americans." And he said, no. And I said, well, then forget it. I'm not going to do it.
There you go.
So he came back quickly and said, yes, you can do one section on it. And so I began the film with it. And as part of that, of course, I unearthed this old footage that had been literally film footage from the 60s, from Cleveland, Ohio, where I hailed from, and of Russell Means, who most people don't know. Obviously, many people know that Russell Means was, probably one of the 20th century's great Lakota leaders, and they don't know that Russell Means lived in Cleveland, Ohio. And he lived in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s, and he started something called the AIM movement. Was started in Cleveland, Ohio. Of all places, Russell Means lived longer in Cleveland, Ohio than he did for a time in the Dakotas. And so, I unearthed all of this footage about how Russell Means started the movement here, and I only had 8 or 9 minutes or whatever on commercial television to do this section, but it was such a powerful thing, and it was so intuitive for me to do it, and I didn't know why. I did not know why. And then when I did a Yuipi ceremony, I was told that I had been selected to communicate this to the white man, if you will.
To be the bridge.
And that I would, to be the bridge, and that I would be the bridge again.
Yep.
And of course, now with what the grandmothers are revealing, I mean, the sacred female, and the aspect of that, the grandmothers are the wisdom carriers, and that they are allowed now to reveal this to select people, to the message, to reveal to select people. And so, one of my prayers is indeed that I was, have been selected, and that someday, somehow, soon, the money will manifest in order for me to document this and do so in a very thorough and meaningful way.
So again, if there's any rich people out there.
Well, it's just lovely speaking with you about all of this, because the diversity, I care about my film, Letters from Generation RX. Obviously, I've dedicated, as I say, 8 years of my life to listening to stories of real people. But I also know I'm not a one-trick pony, and it's like my deepest roots and my deepest caring is about injustice, and about spirituality and about healing. And so people would like to characterize me as if I am just a, alternative medicine guy or anti-psychiatry guy, or, whatever the heck they want to throw at me. But the truth of the matter is that I believe I've been placed on this earth to help people deal with injustice.
Yeah.
And so my commitment is to the homeless and to the disenfranchised and to now the middle class and to the Lakota and Indian peoples, and yes, to the victims of psychiatry who simply were victimized because they did not have the knowledge, and the knowledge was not shared with them. And so that's my purpose. That's my place on this earth for however long I'm blessed to walk it. And I'm fine with that.
And isn't it interesting that justice making is also part of the spiritual practice of compassion? Justice making, sitting with people and their stories, even when they're painful and horrible, that's all part of compassion. It's all part of what compassion really means, and how it really manifests itself as a force in our lives. In very real, meaningful ways.
Powerful. Yeah, I'll tell you something, Kira. This has been I've said it in front of a couple of audiences when I give speeches. I certainly intellectually know the difference between empathy and sympathy. And yet, you sit across, I don't mean you personally, but I tell people in the audience, you sit across from hundreds of families and hear this story and try telling me that the line isn't blurred. And so indeed, I know I've been harmed by this. I use the term swallowed death because I really believe that. And, if there were an ayahuasca experience for me, or a Lakota experience, or both, the healing that I know or would pray would come forth would be to release all of that dark energy, because I know I've absorbed it.
Yeah.
And I know it's hurt me. But I also know, as you say, what my greater purpose is. And so therefore I had to do that. If I didn't absorb it, if compassion wasn't what ruled my day, and then transforming those stories in a way that hopefully people will see en masse across the globe in a way that we can truly see ourselves through the eyes of our neighbors. Then, if we can do that, then that alchemizes all of that energy, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what the Wichisha Wakan does for the tribe, the holy man, is swallows death for the tribe. That's what the sun dancers do. They sacrifice, dancing in the hot sun for 4 days with no food and water, and piercing, so that the people can live. So it takes that damage and that suffering in some way to release, like you say, release those dark forces. And it's not for everyone. It's certainly not for everyone.
No. Nor is ayahuasca.
Right.
You'd like to believe that it would be, or that it is, but no. I mean, there are people, there are many people, perhaps the vast majority, that just couldn't process it and are so resistant to it and can't let go of their ego mind for any length of time. But I mean, I literally kneel at the altar of, if there's one good thing about Catholicism in the era that I was raised, it was that it was a Latin Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And I was an altar boy, by the way. And the reason why that was powerful for me was because it was a foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not the norm. And it was not about the priest. The priest had his back to the audience at that time. And it was about praying to, there was a tabernacle, right? The thing where the hosts were and everything else. But, 25 years, 30, however many years later, I'm in Vietnam, and I decided after a 6-month, very painful journey in Vietnam in 1987, where I saw children, like Amerasian children fathered by American servicemen, left behind and eating out of garbage cans and all this other stuff. And I come through this experience, and I come to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and I was like, man, there's a church, there's a French-built two-tier steeple church. And so I'm like, I got to go. So the next morning at 5 o'clock, I get up and I go. And lo and behold, the Mass was in Latin. And so for the first time in however many decades, I was there with my eyes closed and reconnecting with that and purifying what I had just experienced over the first, 5 weeks of my journey there. And so there is this need within us, within all of us, to find some way, rather than, alcohol, rather than, just, smoking pot and smoking yourself into oblivion, to deal with the trauma that most of us encounter on whatever level. So some people are ridiculously dismissive of the truth of the Lakota experience and of indigenous experiences in general. But not I. You won't find me in that camp ever, because I find them absolutely remarkable individuals, remarkably powerful people who have great importance and great import to me personally, and I think great importance to us, where in our society, especially as people are addicted to the phones and everything that's available around us, the 500 TV channels and all the noise and crap and nonsense, we're going to increasingly see that we have people who, guess what? They're not bipolar. They just have been harmed to no end, by their environment.
Yeah.
In addition to all the crap that we put into our bodies and everything else, and they're going to need healing in a way that no Western healer has ever been able to touch. So.
Yeah, and if you think about it, post-traumatic stress disorder, is it really a disorder? I mean, it's an injury, really. it's damage done to a person from trauma. So in a way, we all have that same reaction, right? So how much of a disorder is it? Is that just how we respond to extreme trauma? You know, it's so labeling it even as a disorder is, I think, part of the problem, since it really is a normal way to react to horror.
Well, you and I are obviously in sync because my very first sweat lodge was in Port Angeles, right on the straits leading to the ocean, and I think, it was a powerful experience in part because it was my first, but it was even more powerful because I was with some Vietnam vets who were trying to heal. And it was an immensely powerful experience. And part of my job was, when I showed up, was to be the keeper of, and I don't know the term for it, maybe you can enlighten me, but I was the guy that was like the night before the sweat lodge was baking the rocks.
Mm-hmm. The firekeeper?
That was eating, yeah. Well, is that what it is? I mean, I had to keep turning them, and I had to add rocks, and I had to do other things for the ceremony the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, I met a man named Dennis Arndt, who I've lost touch with a little bit, but who was a Hollywood actor. And he's a Vietnam vet, and he was coming there for the ceremony the next day. And 1 o'clock in the morning, there I was, still standing there by the fire, and he came, waddling up through the forest, and he said, "Oh, well, thank you for keeping the fire, because I was planning on doing this." He had brought his heartfelt letters that he had written to his father, and that his father had written him, and his father had just died a couple of days before, and he was meant to put these in the fire and let them go up into the aether.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the next day was very, very, I did over 3 days, and it was very, very, very powerful experience. And that was was with Vietnam vets for my first ever sweat lodge. So it's very cool. And I'm glad to know. I mean, obviously you and I have never spoken before now, but it's neat to see that kind of synchronicity, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. And, you want to know there's more synchronicity. My brother, Peter, is a Vietnam vet, the one who taught me how to sing Lakota powwow songs. And he's a sun dancer as well. And I'll tell you, he would never admit it, but I think he would be also, called a medicine man as well. He'll probably slap me for saying that, but years ago.
Only lovingly.
Yes. Reminds me of that comedy video, Slapping Medicine Man. It's hilarious. If anybody hasn't seen it, check that out. It's really funny. The 1491s. But years ago, I was told that I had a big fibroid, and they, it was like another time that they wanted to do a hysterectomy. And this thing was like the size of a grapefruit. It was big. And I contacted him, and I said, "Yep, I've got this big fibroid, and they want to take my lady parts." And he goes, "Well, I'm going into the sweat tonight with my Sundance brothers, and we'll pray for you." And I was like, "Well, thank you very much." So I went back to get another, ultrasound on the fibroid and everything. And what had 2 weeks earlier been the size of a grapefruit with a blood supply was calcified, the size of a pea, and had no more blood supply. So the hysterectomy was canceled. And that's from a group of Sundance Vietnam veterans going into a sweat lodge and praying for me. And
that's amazing. And I've heard similar stories to that. And one more synchronicity is that, again, for whatever reason, is that I've been involved in the whole Vietnam veteran experience, not only because my brother is a Vietnam vet, but but I've literally been on the ground floor of the Vietnam vet PTSD. I know the man that coined the term PTSD. He wrote a book called The Forgotten Warrior in 1977, I believe. And so for whatever reason, I have a real strong connection with Vietnam veterans also. You know, I mean, part of the sadness of my life thus far, the joy has been my children, just immense joy. But part of the sadness of my life is that my professional life is that I have not had access to the kinds of money that, I'm not talking Michael Moore money here, but I'm just saying the kinds of money to do these projects, because I told you about the other one. I mean, Vietnam vets and PTSD and all that, that's another one. I mean, that's another film right there. And I already have it mapped out what I would do. I've had it mapped out for decades. I know exactly what I would do.
Well, maybe you could
do... maybe this prayer will be heard in the universe. I don't mean by any individual necessarily listening right now,
right?
But I just mean that prayer in the universe. These are important things. I mean, they're important for us to speak about in a human way, a very personal way, and they are important for other people. And they're important because they shift our daily experience that, from the point of, oh, well, poor me, I'm broke, or poor me, this, that, and the other, to that, a lot of people have it a lot worse than I do, you do, so many people do, who are busy using their energy for things like, and living in loss, lack, and limitation, as opposed to you living in gratitude, or me living in gratitude.
It's important. Even when you have nothing. Actually, that's probably the most important time, is to start living in gratitude, because then you get to see the miracle of how that changes your life. And I think that's why people are so amazed by those who are, considered poor, destitute, who do live in gratitude, and are just like, wow, they're so happy for their lives and their relationships. And there's a lot of people who have an endless supply of money who would give anything to be able to live like that, and to have that kind of orientation towards life.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. And I also
Seriously
find that people who have the least are the most generous as well. Like my sister went to Kenya, and she went with the Quakers, and there were people whose home she visited who, killed their last chicken to feed her for dinner. Things like that are just very moving. And it's the same, in Indian country as well. The most generous people, are living in a trailer on the reservation. The most giving, generous people. And we could all benefit from, that sort of orientation. Because what's really important is not what we collect, but what we're able to give, the gifts that we're able to give of ourselves. Like, that's why I called your work a gift, because that's what it is. Our creative, the things that we do with our creativity are our gifts to the world, and they're sacred.
Well, I listen. First of all, I'm very humbled by you saying that, and I obviously align with that. And my prayer has always been, and I think it's pretty clear that my prayer has always been, give me $1 million. I'm not going to use it on a Mercedes,
Right.
I mean, or to buy a bigger house, or I want to live humbly, and naturally I'd like to be able to share what I believe are the gifts that have been given to me to use in this life, and to be able to spread that. And so, my prayer for Letters from Generation RX, let alone any future work, is simply that that we find the millions, we find the tens of millions, or they find us, however it happens, and that they in turn share, so that, as people, we can shut down those kinds of tragedies from happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this film it's obviously very personal, Kira, but it's so important because these are lovely people, just wonderful, lovely families and individuals who just had something so treasured robbed from them for the stupidest reason.
Yeah.
And for the stupidest reasons of prescribing habits.
Right.
How can a pediatrician not know everything left, right, and sideways about the side effects that we talked about 2 hours ago in Ritalin that then lead a child to become psychotic before putting him or her on an antipsychotic? How can a GP or a general practitioner be so clueless that they give someone who's feeling a little anxious Paxil?
Right.
That then in turn may cause them to harm someone so dear and precious to their lives or themselves. Yeah. And yet it manifests day after day after day after day. And so, my prayer with this film is that we reverse that. And we can reverse it now. We can do it now. Mm-hmm. And we can spread it to tens of millions of people now, who then, we pray, spread to tens of millions of others. And that we end it. And we dry up the well, the pharmaceutical well. It's not that we don't want pharma around. If pharma can create something, that's going to, save the world from the next apocalypse somehow, because they're the only ones that had the might, if they put all their might together, to create something like antibiotics humbly did in 1906 and 08, that truly did change lives, right? Mm-hmm. If indeed they can form some function that's vital to humanity, lovely. If they can't, and they're just benefiting the few, meaning their shareholders, and the few who I don't want to say the few who benefit from antidepressants, because maybe I know there are millions of people out there who are choosing to use them because they believe that that's the only way. And if they're helped by them, well, bless them. I pray no harm ever comes to them. But, we can shift the paradigm whenever we want to shift it.
Yeah.
And everything you've said to me is evidence of that. Mm-hmm. And hopefully everything that I've shared with people over the last 2 hours is evidence of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny that a couple of times you mentioned the, gay marriage and marijuana legalization, because I am in my 40s. I'm 45, and those were kind of the two things that I worked on, in college in my 20s, and even in high school. I had a lot of gay friends in high school because I was very open about not really giving a shit about people's sexual orientation and not, judging people about that. And so, and back in the 80s when I was in high school, that was pretty, it was not that
was pretty avant-garde.
Yeah. I didn't know the word for it.
Behavior.
Yes. And the Lakota have a lot to teach about that as well, because traditional Lakota culture, there's a sacred role for everybody, and the Creator does not make mistakes, and that includes gay people. So that's another bit of wisdom from the Lakota that we can celebrate today as well.
Amen to that.
Yeah. So, and then also, when I was in college, I met Jack Harrar, who wrote the book The Emperor Wears No Clothes. and did a big project with that as well. And it was my idea to get a booth at Lollapalooza. And yeah, and I did that for a while because it was just common sense. Whether you personally consume cannabis or not is not the issue at all. The issue is that the things that people believe about cannabis just simply were not true then. People know a lot more now, but it took years of work. This is not a sudden event. This took years of educating people, of people like myself, going around to different colleges and saying, let's look at the science that we have so far. Let's look at how flawed, the studies that have looked into marijuana so far are flawed. And then let's look at how the government is already providing medical marijuana to people like my friend Elvie Musica, who was the first woman in America to get medical marijuana for her glaucoma, which she had had from the time that she was a child. And she's another example of how, common sense doesn't always reign, because they were injecting anti-cancer drugs into her eyeballs as a child instead of just giving her marijuana, which is the only thing that we still know today saves the sight of people with glaucoma. So there's a lot of things going on, just a lot. Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here today and talking to you, and I hope that you can come back, and I hope we can help you promote your work, and I hope that you get to make the movies that you're praying to make. And any way I can help you, if even if you want to promote some sort of crowd fundraising. I helped Verushka Franceschi meet her Kickstarter goal with her movie A Crack in Everything. So, if that's a route you're thinking about going, I'd certainly love to help you there too.
Well, thank you. We did that about a year ago, and it wasn't very successful. So, but most importantly, I thank you for the invitation to be here for a few hours and talk about not only the film but things that are important to both of us, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's been a real honor and pleasure to do so, and I'll happily do so anytime you'd like.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody at People's Internet Radio who let me take over the stream at my unscheduled time and accommodate your travel schedule. So I'm going to have to give up the stream now, and thank you very much.
Blessings to you and all.